when the earth shifts beneath our feet, or when the rains just fail for years on end, or maybe when some unseen enemy, like an epidemic, spreads across continents. What actually stops a society from just completely spiraling into panic and collapse? We often look at history, don't we, through the lens of, say, political shifts or big military campaigns. But maybe the real test of any civilization, it's governance, it's ethics, it's very structure that's revealed in those moments of overwhelming catastrophe. And that capacity for sustained, proactive resilience, that's really the core of our deep dive today. We're going back 14 centuries. We're going to explore how one specific community navigated these huge existential threats. And they use an approach driven by, well, intense preparation, profound social solidarity, and a faith-driven commitment to resilience. When you really analyze the mechanics, it looks stunningly organized, almost modern, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's quite remarkable.
The fundamental insight we're chasing today, I think, is this. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't just manage disasters reactively. He didn't just clean up afterwards. He seems to have introduced a systematic blueprint for resilience planning. He mandated decentralized social solidarity and enforced really ethical public health protocols.
And this was long before many societies even conceptualized formal state disaster frameworks. That's the really striking part.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Our mission, as always, is to take this stack of source material. Today, we're focusing on cases 36 through 40 and really extract the critical, high-impact nuggets of knowledge for you. So whether you're working in public policy, maybe emergency management, or, just seeking a better understanding of historical governance, think of this as your accelerated path to insight.
Yeah, we've got an exciting journey ahead, I think, because these cases, they aren't just historical footnotes about survival. They really reveal a comprehensive model for proactive governance. Governance designed to mitigate the mess before it happens, essentially. It's about building structures that inherently resist collapse.
Exactly, building resilience right into the system. So let's get straight to the blueprints then, and maybe unpack the mindset first.
Right. We tend to imagine ancient societies as being perpetually reactive, don't we? Just sort of praying for the best when a drought or a flood struck. But the sources, especially when you look at Case 36, they absolutely shatter that notion. They seem to demand systematic preparation. So Case 36 outlines this philosophy around, well, what we might call natural disaster warning systems today. But the core mandate here wasn't just about weathering the storm when it hit. It was encouraging a perpetual state of vigilance, preparation for calamities that might not even be visible yet. It's like the institutionalization of long-term foresight. And what's truly fascinating, I find, is that this was codified as an ongoing community responsibility. The sources advise the community, and look, not just the leaders, but the whole community, to actively store resources. We're talking bulk grain, preserved water, medical supplies, maybe even preparing physical defenses before any immediate threat appears on the horizon.
So not just waiting for the weather forecast.
Exactly. This wasn't some specialized advice just for governors or elites. It was presented as like a standing operating procedure for every responsible household, every tribe. It was embedded.
Okay, but if the prophet, peace be upon him, was delivering this message, what was the practical mechanism? Like, how did they actually ensure people kept their stores stocked during peacetime when things felt safe? Was it just, trust?
Well, it seems to have been a blend. Partly a faith-based imperative, a moral duty, but also practical governance. For instance, communal granaries were established. These were often managed by trusted individuals, ensuring a buffer stock was available for the collective. But maybe more importantly, the culture itself was geared toward recognizing the inherent volatility of the environment.
Right.
I mean, if you lived through a serious drought, you learned the lesson, didn't you? That memory sticks. So this perpetual reminder, perhaps from lived experience and religious teaching, meant that preparation wasn't just an episodic response to an alert. It was more like a continuous lifestyle choice, integrated into how you lived.
That makes the lesson incredibly direct and, well, modern, actually. Prevention is fundamentally, ethically, and economically better than cure. From a simple municipal budget standpoint today, spending $1 on preemptive defenses, say, flood barriers probably saves $10, maybe more, in cleanup and recovery later. Not to mention the lives saved, which is immeasurable.
And that very concept, that's the conceptual blueprint for pretty much every serious modern emergency response system we have. Think about it. This ancient vigilance, you could argue, is the philosophical ancestor of our global seismic monitoring networks, our complex meteorological modeling, our formal disaster warning protocols issued by agencies like FEMA or the NDMA in other countries.
Yeah, it's the difference between being totally surprised by the earthquake and having earthquake-resistant building codes already mandated and in place for years.
Precisely. Now, here's the enduring challenge, and it connects directly back to why this ancient model seems to have worked effectively. We struggle constantly today with maintaining preparedness when things are calm, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Complacency sets in.
It does. Governments/budgets for infrastructure maintenance or disaster relief funds, when the immediate memory of the last catastrophe phase, budgets get tight, other priorities emerge. But the historical effectiveness of the prophetic model, it seems, relied heavily on that continuous, ethically mandated vigilance. The core message was, the world is inherently unpredictable, therefore preparation must be constant. It needs to be sustained, integrated into the structure of daily life. And that takes exceptional commitment, sustained across generations. It's not easy.
That idea of sustained vigilance, it naturally leads us to systematic planning, doesn't it? And Case 38 gives us a really remarkable, maybe even surprising case study in this kind of proactive governance. We're talking about the massive coordinated effort of digging the trench during the Battle of Kandak, the Battle of the Trench.
Yes, and this is where we might need to shift our perspective a bit. Traditionally, we view Kandak purely as military history, right? A defensive tactic. But the sources, when you read them with disaster preparedness in mind, they really compel us to see it as something more, as a monumental case of disaster preparedness thinking.
Okay, let's drill down into that a bit. For listeners who might not be familiar with all the details,
Mhm.
the community in Medina faced this overwhelming coalition force basically surrounding the city. So how does digging a purely defensive military trench translate into systematic disaster preparedness?
Well, think about what systematic planning is really about. It's about ensuring survival under extreme duress. It's anticipating the worst-case scenario and building large-scale infrastructure to mitigate its maximal impact. The siege of Medina wasn't just a potential battle. The siege itself was planned by the attackers as a devastating resource and humanitarian crisis. The community was trapped. External resources, food, water, trade immediately cut off. They faced starvation, exposure to the elements, and intense psychological pressure, potentially for weeks on end. That's a disaster scenario.
Right, the siege is the disaster, not just the potential fight.
Exactly. And the trench, this massive feat of engineering and sheer labor, was the infrastructure built ahead of that disaster, truly hitting its peak. It wasn't just a tactic to stop cavalry charges, though it did that too. It was a proactive plan for survival under extreme duress. It mitigated the impact of the expected event, the prolonged siege, by providing physical defense, yes, but also by preserving the population within a defensible space, and crucially, buying time.
Buying time until the attacker's own resources were exhausted, perhaps.
Precisely. Buying time for diplomacy, for internal cohesion, for the weather to change, for the alliance against them to fracture. Time is a critical resource in a disaster. The trench bought them that time.
The insight there is pretty staggering, actually. That proactive, large-scale infrastructure projects, even when their primary aim seems military or defensive, serve a crucial secondary function of disaster mitigation. The effort required must have been absolutely immense. This wasn't just a few guys with shovels, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was a whole-of-society mobilization. I mean, just imagine the logistical challenge. Organizing hundreds, maybe thousands of people, not just soldiers, but everyday community members, men, women, contributing in various ways to dig a trench several miles long.
Yeah.
And it had to be deep enough, wide enough to be effective against cavalry, all while facing this imminent threat, probably with limited food and resources themselves.
Wow.
This demanded incredible centralized resource allocation, coordination of labor shifts, distribution of food to the workers, and importantly, immense trust in the leadership. Trust enough to dedicate massive amounts of communal energy toward an infrastructure project for a threat that was, at that point, only just materializing on the horizon.
So the real lesson isn't just about, digging a ditch. It's about the governance capacity required. The ability to mobilize society for a complex, large-scale, preemptive public works based on foresight.
It's exactly right. It highlights that crucial difference between reactive crisis management, which might have been just huddling inside the existing city walls, and praying and proactive systematic planning. Building the robust defenses before the enemy or the catastrophe fully arrives. And, you can draw a direct parallel here to modern government investment. Why do nations invest billions in seawalls? Or reinforcing critical bridges against earthquakes? or constructing multi-purpose tunnels and stormwater systems.
Because they serve a dual function.
Exactly. That infrastructure planning serves a vital dual function. It supports daily life and commerce, yes, but it also acts as a silent, powerful form of disaster mitigation and defense for the entire population when crisis hits. The Kondak Trench, in its context, was the 7th century equivalent of that kind of large-scale infrastructure planning, designed specifically for population survival against a foreseen disaster, the siege.
And it requires a leader, doesn't it, with enough vision and critically enough credibility to convince the people to sweat and toil today for a threat they only believe might fully materialize tomorrow. That speaks volumes about the level of trust and the commitment to a shared vision of safety within that community. That intense focus on planning for survival, it leads us pretty naturally to the terrifying reality of widespread disease. Historically, epidemics were, the ultimate stress test for any society, weren't they?
Absolutely devastating.
And Case 37 provides what I consider a really stunning, structured example of ethical public health management, especially for its time.
Yes, Case 37 deals with the Plague of Emmaus. This was a massive outbreak that occurred a bit later during the expansion period of the early Muslim community. And the sources detail how a defined ethical management framework was immediately applied for handling this widespread disease. It shows that these principles we're discussing weren't just reactive one-offs from Medina, they were foundational, applicable in new contexts.
The specific measures are what are truly jaw-dropping for a pre-scientific age, I think. The sources say it mandated strict quarantine measures. If you were in the area affected by the plague, you were prohibited from leaving. You couldn't flee and potentially take the contagion with you.
Right. Containment.
And conversely, if you were outside the infected zone, you were prohibited from entering it. Basic lockdown, essentially.
That's the deep lesson here, the ethical underpinning of the entire framework. The preservation of human life must take absolute and immediate precedence, even over the most highly valued aspects of normal society, like economic activity, vital trade routes connecting cities, or even the basic freedoms of movement that people naturally cherish. That's a profound ethical commitment established centuries ago.
Okay, but hold on. Let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Imposing strict quarantine, especially if Emmaus was a major hub for trade and travel, which many places were, that's also catastrophic in its own way, right?
Oh, certainly.
It immediately halts commerce, it disrupts supply chains, it could potentially starve out the non-infected areas too if their supplies relied on trade passing through the quarantine zone. How did they manage the resulting, short-term economic chaos while sticking to this very strict ethical commitment to life preservation?
That's a really essential question, and I think it speaks to the sophistication of the overall response, not just the quarantine itself. The economic disruption was absolutely acknowledged, it wasn't ignored. However, the governing principle seems to have been that a massive loss of life from plague is irreversible. Economic slowdown, however painful, is ultimately reversible. So the governance structure had to rely on those other pillars we're going to discuss.
Oh, okay.
Namely, the robust social safety nets, like the immediate application of emergency zakat funds, which we'll see in Case 39, and the existence of strategic food reserves from Case 40. These were needed to mitigate the immediate suffering caused by the necessary economic shutdown that quarantine entailed.
So quarantine wasn't a standalone measure. It needed an economic buffer to be ethically sustainable to prevent a different kind of disaster.
Exactly. It had to be part of a system. And it just speaks volumes, doesn't it, that they relied on observed data, seeing how the disease spread, and a profound common sense regarding contagion, even without knowing about viruses or bacteria. They understood the principle of human-to-human transmission, or at least transmission linked to place and movement, and the necessary solution seemed to be isolation. This wasn't simple guesswork. It was a high-stakes public health policy based on preserving the maximum number of lives possible across the whole community.
And if we look at modern public health, the connection is direct, isn't it? This feels like the direct historical lineage to contemporary policies. Things like mandatory travel restrictions during outbreaks, regional lockdowns, border controls, public health directives aimed at controlling the spread of contagion.
Every single time a modern government invokes an emergency order to limit non-essential travel or issues a stay-at-home directive to flatten the curve, they are, consciously or not, utilizing a governance principle that was articulated back then. A principle that prioritized broad community well-being over immediate individual convenience or short-term economic activity.
It really puts the modern debates into perspective.
It does. The debate today often hinges on that very delicate balance. Public health versus the economy, it's always framed as a trade-off. But this historical precedent, The explicit prioritizing of life preservation within this framework, it lends enormous moral weight, I think, to modern decisions that lean towards public safety first. It communicates that the initial paramount response must be limiting the spread, containing the threat to life. The rationale seems to hold true across time. A healthy population, even one facing temporary economic hardship, can always rebuild an economy eventually. A decimated population cannot. This framework effectively defined human life as the ultimate non-negotiable resource that the system was designed to protect above all else.
So the ethical framework provided the clear answer to that modern dilemma of economy versus life. In this model, life wins, clearly. And the other mechanisms, the Social Security, the food stores, they had to be robust enough to ensure that ethical choice didn't inadvertently lead to starvation for the survivors. It all had to work together. That focus on ethical public health, making sure people survive the immediate threat, transitions perfectly into shoring up the internal structural resilience of the community. Because, well, surviving a plague or a siege is kind of meaningless if the community then collapses into famine or internal strife afterwards, right?
Exactly. Survival isn't just about the crisis moment, it's about the aftermath too.
So now we look at cases 39 and 40, which seem to deal directly with building that longer-term social and food resilience. Okay, case 39. This highlights what seems to be a core principle of their disaster response, actively encouraging robust solidarity and mutual aid, making it the primary instantaneous first responder, almost. The idea seems to be that when centralized resources inevitably fail or get strained, which they always do during a really widespread catastrophe, the community itself acts as its own decentralized relief system.
Yes, this community resilience piece is absolutely critical, and the sources provide quite concrete examples of how this was supposed to work, how it was realized. We see evidence of organized, almost neighborhood-level food-sharing efforts. We see the rapid decentralized establishment of collective shelter solutions for people displaced by maybe localized events like a flash flood or a fire. And perhaps most systematically, we see the strategic channeling of the zakat distribution system, the mandatory charitable giving inherent in Islam specifically to immediately bolster aid efforts during a crisis period.
Right, so zakat, in this context, wasn't just an abstract religious obligation people fulfilled whenever. It functioned almost like an economic circuit breaker, didn't it? An immediate, localized relief fund that could be activated much faster than any central government bureaucracy could likely manage.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. The core lesson of Case 39, I think, is that social bonds, the connections between people and mutual dependence, are fundamental lifelines. They're not weaknesses.
Yeah.
In times of extreme hardship, decentralization, in this sense, becomes a strength, not a weakness. It disperses the burden of response across many shoulders and helps ensure aid reaches the most local level where it's needed almost instantly.
How does this model contrast with systems that rely maybe more exclusively on state-led relief efforts? You know, the big government agencies rolling in?
Well, state-led efforts are crucial, of course, especially for large-scale logistics and resources, but they are often inherently slow, sometimes bureaucratic, and can be easily overwhelmed, particularly in really large-scale events that disrupt infrastructure. By institutionalizing and actively facilitating mutual aid, the prophetic model seems to harness the strength of community-driven aid right at the ground level. It promotes agility and local knowledge. The person next door knows what's needed immediately.
This sounds, well, it sounds exactly like the blueprint for the modern global ecosystem we see today of rapid deployment NGOs, local disaster volunteer groups, CERT teams, neighborhood resilience programs.
It really does.
Often, the fastest, most effective initial aid comes from neighbors helping neighbors, sometimes hours or even days before the first official government truck arrives on the scene.
Absolutely. The ability of a single street or a neighborhood or a local faith group or any network, really, to feed, shelter, and provide immediate comfort to its own displaced members, that's often the first and arguably the most resilient line of defense in a disaster. And crucially, this kind of decentralized system, woven into the social fabric, is much harder to break down completely, whether it's by enemy action in a conflict or by catastrophic infrastructure failure in a natural disaster. It's more robust than relying on a single, centralized response structure that could be a single point of failure. The resilience is distributed.
Okay, so moving from that immediate social aid, that neighbor helping neighbor aspect, to longer-term physical stability, we land on case 40, food security planning. This seems to look beyond the immediate hours or days of crisis to ensure nutritional stability during prolonged periods of scarcity. Things like famine, maybe a long siege like Kondak, or even just systemic supply chain disruptions.
Yes, and the underlying philosophy here, again, feels profoundly rooted in ethics and, importantly, dignity. The governing principle seems to be that hunger must not be allowed to destroy human dignity or completely break the social order. Therefore, ensuring basic food security is established as an undeniable duty, a duty shared by the state or leadership and the community itself.
So how was this duty translated into practical governance mechanisms? What did they actually do?
The sources seem to highlight several interlocking systems. First, and maybe most obviously, systematic grain storage was implemented as a strategic reserve. This wasn't just about saving leftovers for the next day. It was about consciously maintaining a buffer stock large enough to weather multiple bad harvests or periods of political instability that might disrupt agriculture or trade. It shows real long-term strategic foresight.
What's national strategic reserves today?
Very much so. Secondly, they implemented, or at least aimed for, robust and fair distribution systems during periods of acute shortage, rationing, essentially. Now, this requires strong, trusted governance to maintain equity, to prevent hoarding by the wealthy or well-connected, and importantly, to help stabilize prices when people are desperate and markets might otherwise go haywire. This act of controlled, fair distribution itself reinforces social justice precisely when stress is highest.
And then there's that specific mechanism we touched on earlier, which seems conceptually brilliant in this context, utilizing zakat al-fitr. We should probably explain this detail carefully for listeners. How does this particular form of zakat function as a preventative welfare mechanism for food security?
Right. Zakat al-fitr is distinct from the general annual zakat on wealth. It's a specific charitable donation required from every Muslim who has the means at the very end of the fasting month of Ramadan. And critically, it's traditionally calculated not in currency, but in a fixed measure of a staple food, like a some measure of wheat or barley or dates. Enough basic food to feed one person for a day.
Okay, a measure of food, not money.
Yes, and here's the crucial part for its function.
Okay.
It must be collected and distributed before the special Eid al-Fitr prayers that mark the end of Ramadan begin.
The timing is key.
The timing is the genius of its function as a food security measure. Ramadan, while a spiritual high point, is also often the period when family resources, especially among the poor, might be stretched thin due to altered work patterns or festive preparations. By mandating this distribution of basic nutrition, actual food, just before the major communal celebration begins, the system ensures that everyone, especially the most vulnerable members of society, has basic food security at that critical juncture. It effectively stabilizes the food base for the entire community simultaneously. It prevents the post-fasting period from immediately tipping the poor into destitution or hunger just as the community comes together to celebrate. It is, in economic terms, preventive welfare par excellence.
Wow. So it functions as a mandated annual systemic injection of strategic food reserves, small amounts, but universally distributed directly into the hands of the needy, timed precisely for maximum social cohesion and nutritional impact.
Absolutely. And thinking about it from an economic philosophy standpoint, maintaining state or community food reserves, this idea of strategic storage, is the definitive buffer against market shocks, weather volatility, unforeseen crises. It's risk management 101. The modern world uses national food reserves, strategic grain storage programs, and even global agreements through organizations like the World Food Program for this exact reason, to stabilize prices and prevent famine. Case 40 reveals that this fundamental understanding that food security is an absolute necessity for political stability, social order, and basic human dignity was foundational centuries ago. Food security ultimately is about preserving that social fabric and human dignity when external pressures threaten to strip both away. #tag synthesis and outro. #key takeaways.
Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground there. We've dived deep into the infrastructure, the social systems, the public health policies that seem to be codified in these 5 cases, 36 through 40. Let's try and bring it all together now. Can we distill the 5 major, maybe actionable takeaways that we've derived from these sources?
Let's try. Okay, number 1, I'd say. Early warning systems combined with disaster vigilance. This mandates that constant proactive awareness. The idea that prevention, through sustained cultural and governmental effort, is inherently better, cheaper, and more ethical than cure.
Right. Number 2, ethical epidemic management, epitomized by those strict life-saving disciplines like quarantine protocols, a system that structurally placed the preservation of human life above even significant short-term economic cost or convenience.
Number 3, systematic preparedness planning, vividly demonstrated by that complex infrastructure mobilization required at Kandak. It proves that good governance must plan for community survival under the worst conceivable duress, not just hope for the best.
Definitely. Number 4, mutual aid and strong community support networks. ensuring that social solidarity and decentralized local resources act as the instantaneous, resilient first responders in any localized crisis, filling the gaps before larger aid arrives.
And finally, number 5, food security is a critical long-term duty. Utilizing mechanisms like strategic reserves and really clever welfare mechanisms like zakat al-fit to maintain stability and preserve human dignity during prolonged periods of scarcity. Hashtag B final. So what analysis? So what does all this mean? What does this comprehensive historical blueprint truly teach us today?
I think the overarching conclusion is pretty inescapable. The prophetic model for disaster response, as reflected in these cases, was not primarily reactive. It wasn't just focused on cleaning up after the floodwaters receded or the epidemic passed. It was fundamentally structurally proactive.
Built-in resilience.
Exactly. It was focused on building intrinsic resilience, physical infrastructure, yes, but also social capital, ethical frameworks into the very structure and social contract of the community before disaster struck. And that requires a level of visionary governance, of foresight, that frankly is often absent when we look back at the historical record. So this insight, I believe, it radically changes how we might view historical governance in this context. It wasn't necessarily haphazard or primitive. In this area, it seems it was sophisticated, anticipatory, and ethically mandated to manage some of the most complex crises known to humanity. Hashtag C. Connecting back to the listener.
So, as you, our listener, integrate these ideas into your understanding of modern challenges, maybe you're involved in relief work or public health policy or perhaps high level governance today, just remember the timeless relevance of these mechanics. The core principles of mandatory preparation, having strict ethical boundaries that prioritize life above all else, and harnessing the power of community, of decentralized strength, these remain the absolute pillars of effective crisis management. In any century, in any geopolitical context, these aren't just historical relics. They feel like universal best practices. Hashtag 2PD. Final provocative thought.
And maybe let me leave you with a challenging thought to consider. Something to mull over as you reflect on what makes a society truly unbreakable in the face of adversity. True, deep-rooted resilience. It's not found primarily in material wealth alone or just in advanced technology. I mean, those things certainly help, especially in the moment of crisis. But perhaps it's found more fundamentally in the non-material virtues. It's found in solidarity, in preparation, and in justice. A community that is rich in those three things, a community that has managed to codify them into its governance structure, into its culture, that community will likely weather any storm better and recover more equitably than a community that is rich only in assets but poor in spirit and connection. Hashtag EA. Next deep dive preview.
That is a profound and I think a very necessary thought to end on. Thank you. And if you found this discussion, particularly around Zakat and those economic stabilization mechanisms, intriguing, then you definitely won't want to miss our next deep dive. We'll be moving into the advanced territory of cases 41 through 50. We'll be focusing entirely on economic emergency management, exploring how the Prophet, peace be upon him, sought to ensure financial stability and maintain justice during times of severe economic upheaval and market crisis. Another critical aspect of resilience. Thank you all for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.